Sometimes our greatest blessings come disguised as our worst nightmares. Life has a way of throwing unexpected challenges at us, only for them to lead us to something extraordinary. Lena never imagined that stepping into a billionaire's office for what she thought was a simple assistant job interview would change her life forever. She had no idea that the arrogant and powerful CEO, Adrian Carter, had a proposal that would shake her world to its core. For Adrian, marriage was nothing more than a business transaction, a contract, a means to an end. His grandfather's will demanded that he marry and produce an heir within a year. Otherwise, he would lose everything he built. Love? It wasn't even a factor. Lena, on the other hand, was struggling to survive. Drowning in debt, she had no choice but to consider Adrian's shocking offer. Become his wife for a year, give him an heir, and walk away with enough money to change her life forever. But there was one thing neither of them anticipated. One revelation that would change everything. She was untouched. And Adrian? The man who never believed in love, he found himself breaking every rule he had set for this arrangement. Was this contract marriage truly just business, or was it the start of something neither of them saw coming? Would you accept a contract marriage if it meant solving all your financial struggles? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Lena Lawson sat at the chipped kitchen table of her tiny apartment, the glow of her laptop casting a faint light across her tired face. Bills were stacked beside her. Hospital invoices, overdue rent notices, a final warning from the power company. Her father's cough echoed from the bedroom down the hall, a constant reminder of why she couldn't give up. Months of job hunting had led nowhere. She'd applied to everything, waitressing, retail, even a dog walking gig. But nothing stuck. That morning, a cryptic email had arrived. An interview at Carter Enterprises, the towering empire dominating the city's skyline. No job title, just a time and place. She'd assumed it was for an office assistant role. Something entry-level, something to keep her afloat. She hadn't dared to hope for more. Now, dressed in her only decent blazer, she stood outside the gleaming glass building, her reflection staring back at her. She smoothed her hair, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. The lobby of Carter Enterprises was a world apart from Lena's reality. Polished marble floors stretched endlessly, and a massive chandelier glittered overhead. Employees in crisp suits moved with purpose, their voices hushed as if afraid to disturb the air. Lena felt small, out of place, clutching her worn-out purse like a lifeline. At the reception desk, a stern woman with a tight bun barely glanced at her. Name? Lena Lawson. I'm here for an interview. The woman typed something, frowned, then handed her a visitor badge. 37th floor. Don't wander. Lena nodded, her nerves buzzing. The elevator ride was silent, the numbers climbing too fast for her racing thoughts. What if this was her chance? What if it wasn't? When the door slid open, she stepped into a hallway lined with frosted glass doors. A young man in a suit, some kind of assistant, she guessed, gestured toward the end of the corridor. Mr. Carter's waiting. Adrian Carter's office was a fortress of modern design. Sleek black furniture, walls of glass framing the sprawling city below, and a desk that looked more like a command center than a workspace. He sat behind it, his broad shoulders filling out a tailored suit, his dark hair neatly combed back. He didn't look up as she entered, his pen scratching across a document with precise, controlled strokes. Lena stood awkwardly near the door, waiting for him to acknowledge her. Seconds stretched into a minute. She cleared her throat softly. Nothing. Finally, she spoke. Mr. Carter, I'm Lena Lawson. I'm here for the interview. His pen stopped. He lifted his head and his eyes, storm gray and piercing, locked onto hers. The weight of his stare made her feel like she'd been caught doing something wrong. You're late, he said, his voice low and clipped, slicing through the quiet like a blade. Lena's stomach dropped. She'd been held up at reception, sent to the wrong floor by mistake. But the sharpness in his tone told her explanations wouldn't matter. I apologize, she said, forcing her voice to stay even. It won't happen again. He set the pen down, leaned back in his chair, and studied her. His expression was a wall, cold, unyielding, like he was calculating her worth in real time. Sit, he said, gesturing to the leather chair across from him. She obeyed, her hands folding tightly in her lap. The silence stretched again, heavy and deliberate, as if he wanted her to squirm. She didn't. Not yet. I didn't call you here for an assistant job. he said at last, his tone smooth and matter-of-fact. Lena frowned, caught off guard. Then why? I need a wife. The words hit her like a punch. She blinked, her mind scrambling to process them. Excuse me? You heard me. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the desk. A contract marriage. 1 year. At the end of it, you walk away with $5 million. Her breath caught, a mix of disbelief and absurdity bubbling up. This had to be a prank, some kind of bizarre corporate hazing. You're joking, she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Adrian's gaze didn't waver. I never joke about business. Her pulse quickened. She searched his face for a crack, a hint of humor, but there was none. He was serious. Deadly serious. Why would you need a wife? She asked, her voice quieter now, testing the waters. He exhaled sharply as if the question irritated him. My grandfather's will. If I don't marry and produce an heir within a year, I lose everything. Carter Enterprises, the assets, the estate, all of it. Lena's fingers tightened around her purse strap. An heir. The word sank in slowly, its implications sprawling out in her mind. He wasn't just asking her to play a role, he wanted her to have his child. You'd expect me to... She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Yes, he said, his jaw tightening. That's non-negotiable. Her chest tightened. This was beyond insane. It was a transaction, cold and calculated, like she was a line item on his balance sheet. And yet he sat there, calm and composed, as if he'd just offered her a promotion instead of a life-altering deal. Why me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He tilted his head slightly, assessing her again. I did my research, Miss Lawson. Your father's medical bills, the foreclosure notice on your apartment. You're drowning in debt. Desperation makes people reliable. The air rushed out of her lungs. He knew, of course he knew. A man like Adrian Carter didn't make moves without leverage. Her life, her struggles, her pain was just data to him, a tool to secure her compliance. This benefits us both, he continued, his tone unwavering. You get financial security, I get my inheritance. No emotions, no complications. A clean arrangement. Lena's mind spun. She should walk out. She should tell him where he could shove his contract. But $5 million? It wasn't just money, it was freedom. A chance to save her father, to breathe again without the weight of debt crushing her. She swallowed hard. What happens after the year? You leave, he said simply. The child stays with me. You'll have no obligations beyond that. Her stomach twisted. A child, her child, left behind like a business asset. She wanted to scream, to throw something, but instead she sat frozen, the folder he slid across the desk catching her eye. Take it, he said. Read it, think it over, but don't take too long. I don't wait for anyone. The folder sat there, pristine and unassuming, like a key to a door she wasn't sure she wanted to open. Her hand hesitated above it, trembling slightly. Signing it would change everything. Walking away might cost her the only lifeline she had left. Lena left the office in a daze, the contract tucked into her bag like a secret she didn't want to acknowledge. She rode the elevator down alone, the hum of the machinery filling the silence. Her reflection stared back at her in the mirrored walls. Pale, wide-eyed, a woman on the edge of a decision she couldn't unmake. Back in her apartment, she sat on her lumpy couch, the folder open on the coffee table. The terms were laid out in crisp black ink. Marriage for 1 year, conception within 6 months, $5 million upon completion, full custody to Adrian Carter. She read it 3 times, each word carving deeper into her resolve. Her father coughed again from the bedroom, weaker this time. She closed her eyes, picturing the hospital bills paid, the treatments he needed, the life she could give him. Then she pictured a child, a faceless, nameless baby, handed over to a man who saw it as a means to an end. She buried her face in her hands. What kind of person was she if she said yes? What kind if she said no? The next day, Lena returned to Carter Enterprises, the contract unsigned but heavy in her bag. She'd barely slept, her mind a battlefield of doubt and necessity. She needed answers, more than Adrian's cold assurances. When she stepped into his office, he was standing by the window, his back to her, the city sprawling out beneath him like a kingdom he ruled. He didn't turn as she entered. "I have questions," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "Ask them," he replied, still facing the glass. Before she could, the door flew open with a bang. A woman stormed in, tall, blonde, and radiating fury. Her designer heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, and her green eyes blazed as they landed on Lena, then snapped to Adrian. "Adrian, what the hell is this?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the room like a whip. Lena froze, her pulse spiking. The woman, Samantha, she'd later learn, looked like she belonged here, in this world of wealth and power, not like Lena, who felt like an intruder. Adrian turned slowly, his expression as impassive as ever. "Samantha, you're in the wrong office." "Don't play games with me," Samantha snapped. "I heard the rumors. A contract marriage? You're actually doing this?" Lena's grip tightened on her bag. Rumors? So she wasn't the first woman he'd approached. The realization stung, though she wasn't sure why. "You no longer have any say in my decisions," Adrian said, his voice ice cold, a stark contrast to Samantha's heat. Samantha's lips curled into a bitter smile. "You're making a mistake." She turned to Lena, her gaze sharp and venomous. "Do yourself a favor, sweetheart. Run while you still can." With that, she spun on her heel and stormed out, the door slamming shut behind her. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Lena's eyes darted to Adrian. Who was she? He didn't answer immediately, his jaw tightening as he moved back to his desk. "Someone who doesn't matter anymore," he said finally, his tone clipped. But the look in his eyes, guarded, fleeting, told her otherwise. There was history there, a story he wasn't sharing. "Think about the contract," he said, as if the interruption hadn't happened. "I'll expect your answer by tomorrow." Lena's heart pounded as she left the office, Samantha's warning echoing in her mind. She wasn't just stepping into a deal, she was stepping into a storm, one she wasn't sure she'd survive. Lena stood in the stark, minimalist office of a city clerk, the fluorescent hum overhead the only sound as she signed her name on the dotted line. No white dress, no bouquet, no music swelling in the background, just a stack of papers and the scratch of a pen. Adrian Carter stood beside her, his presence towering and detached, his signature already drying on the page. The officiant, a gray-haired man with a bored expression, muttered the necessary words, his voice flat. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Adrian didn't even glance at her. No ceremonial kiss, no flicker of warmth. Just a curt nod as he adjusted his cufflinks and checked his watch. Lena's chest tightened, a pang she couldn't name twisting inside her. She'd known this wasn't a fairy tale, but the coldness of it still cut deeper than she'd expected. They left the clerk's office in silence, sliding into the back of his sleek black car. The city light streaked past the tinted windows, a blur of color against the night. Lena stared out, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the weight of the ring on her finger, an understated platinum band, feeling foreign and heavy. Adrian's voice broke the quiet, low and clipped. "You'll be staying in the guest room." She swallowed, her throat dry. "Of course." He turned his head slightly, his gray eyes catching hers for a fleeting moment. "This arrangement is temporary. Nothing changes unless you want it to." Lena nodded, her jaw tight. She'd signed the contract. She had no right to expect anything beyond what was written. But as the car pulled into the underground garage of his penthouse, a towering glass fortress overlooking the city, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just locked herself into something far bigger than a simple deal. The penthouse itself was a marvel, open concept, with marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, and furniture so pristine it looked untouched. Adrian led her to the guest room without fanfare, gesturing to the space as if showing her a hotel suite. "Your things have been brought up. Let me know if you need anything." Then he was gone, disappearing down the hall to his own quarters. Lena stood alone, the silence pressing in. She was married now, to a stranger, for money. The reality settled over her like a heavy coat she couldn't shrug off. Later that night, Lena sat on the edge of the guest room's massive bed, her reflection staring back at her from a sleek mirror across the room. She'd changed into a silk nightgown, one of the few items provided for her new life here, but it felt like a costume, not hers. The room was luxurious, all clean lines and neutral tones, but it lacked warmth. She felt like an intruder, a guest overstaying her welcome. A sharp knock at the door jolted her from her thoughts. She straightened, her pulse quickening as Adrian stepped inside. He'd shed his suit jacket, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to his forearms. It was the most unguarded she'd seen him, but his presence still filled the room like a storm cloud. He stopped a few feet from the bed, his eyes sweeping over her with that same assessing intensity. "You're nervous," he said, more observation than question. Lena's breath hitched. She looked away, her hands twisting in the fabric of the nightgown. I've never done this before." The words hung between them, fragile and raw. She hadn't meant to say them, not like that, but they slipped out, a confession she couldn't take back. Silence stretched, thick and heavy. When she dared to glance up, Adrian's expression had shifted, his usual mask of control replaced by something unguarded, almost startled. "You're a virgin?" His voice was low, laced with disbelief. Heat flooded her cheeks, embarrassment warring with defiance. "Does that matter?" For a moment, he didn't respond. His brow furrowed, his hand lifting to rub the back of his neck. A rare sign of uncertainty from a man who seemed to command every situation. He'd built this deal on assumptions, that she was pragmatic, experienced, ready to treat it as the transaction it was. But this was a variable he hadn't accounted for. "I didn't expect that," he said finally, his tone quieter now, almost introspective. Lena's stomach nodded. "Does it change anything?" He hesitated, a crack in his armor she hadn't seen before. "It complicates things," he admitted, his jaw tightening as if the words cost him something. Her fingers clenched in her lap. "I signed the contract. Nothing changes." Adrian studied her, his gaze piercing through her resolve. He'd spent years mastering control, keeping emotions at arm's length, but something about her, her honesty, her vulnerability, was throwing him off balance. "I won't force you into anything," he said at last, his voice firm but softer than before. Lena nodded, relief mixing with unease. She'd expected him to push, to demand, but this was different, and she wasn't sure what to make of it. He turned to leave, pausing at the door. "Good night, Lena." The door clicked shut behind him, leaving her alone with her racing thoughts. The dynamics had shifted. She could feel it, but whether that was a step toward something better or a warning of trouble ahead, she couldn't tell. The days that followed were a study in distance. Adrian reverted to his routine, leaving at dawn for Carter Enterprises, returning late, his life a machine of precision and purpose. Lena existed on the edges of it, a silent partner in a marriage that felt more like a legal footnote. The penthouse became her world, its luxury both a comfort and a cage. She wandered its halls, tracing the contours of a life she didn't belong to. The staff, a housekeeper, a chef, moved around her like ghosts, polite but detached. She tried to keep busy, reading books from the study, sketching in a notebook she'd brought, but the emptiness gnawed at her. Adrian's presence when he was there was a quiet force. They exchanged a few words, logistical updates about schedules, brief check-ins about her comfort, but the more she watched him, the more she noticed the cracks in his polished exterior, the way his shoulders tensed during late-night calls, the flicker of frustration when a meeting ran long, the shadow that crossed his face when he thought no one was looking. One evening, she caught sight of something odd. They'd been driven back from a rare dinner out, part of maintaining the public facade of their marriage, when she noticed a black sedan trailing them, its headlights steady in the rearview mirror. Adrian's driver accelerated slightly, weaving through traffic, and the sedan fell back. But the next day she saw it again, parked across the street from the penthouse. Her unease grew. She wasn't naive. Adrian's wealth and influence made him a target. But the increased security, the hushed conversations he had with his team, the way his gaze darted to the windows more often, it all pointed to something brewing beneath the surface. One night, unable to sleep, she ventured to his home office. The door was ajar and she found him there, ending a call. His voice was low, clipped, the words too muffled to catch, but the tension in his frame was unmistakable. He hung up, staring at the phone for a moment before noticing her in the doorway. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice tentative. He looked up, surprise flashing across his face before he masked it. For a beat, he seemed to weigh his response. "There are people who don't want me to have this inheritance," he said at last, his tone measured. Lena stepped closer, her brow furrowing. "Are you in danger?" His lips pressed into a thin line. "Not if I handle it first." The vagueness of his answer didn't ease her nerves. "And me?" His gaze darkened, a quiet intensity flaring in his eyes. "No one will touch you." The words carried a weight beyond reassurance, a promise edged with something fiercer, a warning to unseen enemies. A shiver ran down her spine, not from fear but from the realization that he meant it. Lena was still finding her footing in this strange new life when a moment of impulse changed everything. It was late, past midnight, and Adrian hadn't come home. She'd made dinner, nothing fancy, just a pasta dish, hoping to bridge the gap between them, even if only slightly. When he texted that he'd be in his office, she decided to bring it to him. A small gesture in a marriage built on practicality. She balanced the tray as she approached the office door, the murmur of voices stopping her cold. One was Adrian's, steady and controlled. The other? Samantha. Lena's breath caught, her grip tightening on the tray. She edged closer, the words sharpening as she listened. "She's just a pawn," Samantha said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Do you really think she's going to give you what you want?" Lena's heart thudded against her ribs, each beat loud enough to drown out the room's silence. Adrian's reply was calm, but there was a bite to it. "This isn't your concern anymore." Samantha laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that echoed in Lena's ears. "Oh, Adrian, you always think you're in control, don't you?" Lena couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Pawn. The word sank into her like a stone, cold and heavy. She'd known this was a contract, a means to an end, but hearing it laid bare, spoken with such certainty, made it feel real in a way it hadn't before. She should have walked away, should have left the tray and retreated, but her feet stayed rooted, her mind racing. Before Adrian could respond, the door swung open and Samantha stormed out, her heels clicking against the marble. She didn't see Lena standing there, frozen in the shadows, but Adrian did. Their eyes locked, and for the first time, she saw something flicker in his expression. Guilt, maybe. Or regret. "Lena," he started, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. But she turned away, the tray still trembling in her hands. She set it on a table in the hall and walked back to her room, her steps mechanical. She'd walked into this knowing what it was, a deal, nothing more. So why did Samantha's words sting so much? Why did Adrian's silence feel like a betrayal? That night, Lena lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the darkness pressing in around her. She tried to rationalize it, to remind herself she'd signed up for this. She was a contract wife, a means to an end. Feelings didn't belong here, but the ache in her chest wouldn't fade, and the questions wouldn't stop. Why had Samantha been there? What history lingered between her and Adrian? And why did it feel like he was hiding something bigger than just his inheritance? The floor beneath her wasn't just crumbling, it was shifting, pulling her into a battle she hadn't signed up for. Whether she liked it or not, she was in the middle of it now. And the deeper she fell, the less certain she was of where she'd land. Lena couldn't pinpoint when the shift began. It crept in slowly, like a change in the weather she hadn't noticed until it was too late. Adrian had always been a fortress of control. His interactions with her clipped and transactional, as if she were a clause in one of his contracts. But lately, something had softened. Not in a way that was obvious, but in the quiet, fleeting moments that caught her off guard. It started with his schedule. He'd begun returning to the penthouse earlier, trading late nights at Carter Enterprises for evenings spent in the study or the living room. She'd catch him there, jacket off, tie loosened, a glass of bourbon in hand, his gaze drifting to her as she moved through the space. At first she thought it was a coincidence, his eyes just happened to land on her. But the longer it went on, the more she felt it. He was watching her, not with the cold calculation she'd grown used to, but with something heavier, something she couldn't name. Then there were the small gestures, a security team assigned to her without her asking, their presence discreet but constant whenever she left the penthouse. The way he'd guide her through crowded events, his hand hovering near her back, steering her away from the press of bodies with a subtle authority. The way his jaw tightened when a waiter lingered too long at their table during a rare dinner out, his voice sharp as he dismissed the man. One evening, she couldn't take it anymore. She found him in his office, hunched over a stack of papers, the city skyline glowing beyond the glass behind him. She set a folder of documents on his desk, something mundane about their public appearances, and hesitated before speaking. "Why are you suddenly acting considerate?" Her voice was steady, but her pulse wasn't. Adrian didn't look up, his pen pausing mid-signature. The silence stretched, and she wondered if he'd ignore her. Then he set the pen down, his movements deliberate. "You're my wife," he said, his tone gruff, almost reluctant. "I protect what's mine." Lena scoffed, folding her arms across her chest. "That's funny. I thought I was just a contract." His eyes snapped to hers, sharp and unreadable like a storm cloud rolling in. That hasn't changed. But the way he held her gaze steady, intense, lingering, told a different story. Her breath caught, a flush creeping up her neck. If this was still just business, why did it feel like the air between them had thickened? Why was her heart racing, betraying her resolve to keep this simple? She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Lena." She glanced back, and for a moment, he looked like he might say more. Instead, he shook his head, returning to his work. "Good night." She left the office, her mind a tangle of questions. If this was still a deal, why did it feel like the rules were shifting beneath her feet? Adrian Carter had never cared about the attention he attracted. Women had thrown themselves at him for years, drawn to his wealth, his power, his untouchable aura, and he'd brushed them off with the same indifference he applied to everything outside his goals. It was noise, irrelevant beneath his notice. But that afternoon, as his secretary leaned over his desk, her blouse unbuttoned one notch too far, her voice dripping with suggestion, something unfamiliar stirred in him. "Mr. Carter," she purred, adjusting a stack of files unnecessarily close to him. "You've been working too hard. Maybe you need someone to take care of you." His grip on his pen tightened, an irritation he couldn't place prickling under his skin. "That's not your job," he said, his tone flat, cutting. Her smile faltered, but she pressed on, leaning closer. "Well, if you ever change your mind." The door swung open before she could finish, and Lena stepped inside, a stack of papers in her arms. She froze mid-step, her eyes flicking from the secretary's proximity to Adrian's tense posture. One eyebrow arched, her voice dry. "Am I interrupting something?" Adrian straightened, the irritation shifting into something else. Relief, maybe, or annoyance at being caught off guard. We were just finishing up." The secretary hesitated, giving Lena a slow, appraising look before sauntering out, her heels clicking a little too deliberately. Lena watched her go, then turned back to Adrian with a smirk. "She's subtle." He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples as if the exchange had exhausted him. "She's nothing." Lena tilted her head, studying him. You never used to care about women throwing themselves at you. So why do you look so annoyed? He didn't answer right away, his jaw tightening. He could have said it was unprofessional, a distraction, a waste of time, any number of rational excuses. But the truth gnawed at him, unbidden and unwelcome. He didn't like the idea of another woman near him when Lena was in the room. It was a dangerous thought, one he shoved down as quickly as it surfaced. "You're imagining things?" he muttered, his voice gruffer than intended. Lena's smirk faded into something more curious, her eyes searching his. "Am I?" He didn't respond, turning back to his papers, but the weight of her gaze lingered. She wasn't convinced, and neither was he. For the first time, he wondered if the walls he'd built around himself were starting to crack, and if she was the one holding the hammer. Lena had begun to settle into her strange new reality. Not comfortable exactly, but stable. The penthouse routines, Adrian's guarded presence, the rhythm of their contract life. It was unconventional, but it had a predictability she could navigate. She should have known it wouldn't last. It started with a feeling, a prickle at the back of her neck. The sense of eyes on her when no one should have been there. She'd brush it off as paranoia, but then the signs became harder to ignore. One morning, she found a note slipped under the penthouse door, the handwriting sharp and jagged. "You don't belong here." Her hands shook as she read it, the paper crumpling in her grip. She told herself it was a prank, a mistake, but a few days later another appeared, this time on the windshield of Adrian's car after a trip to the grocery store. Same words, same handwriting. She didn't want to bother him, he had enough on his plate, but the unease gnawed at her until she couldn't keep it quiet. That evening she found him in the living room, staring out at the city lights, a glass of bourbon in hand. She set the notes on the table in front of him, her voice trembling despite her efforts to steady it. "Someone's watching." Adrian's expression darkened as he scanned the messages, his fingers tightening around the glass. "Who gave this to you?" "I don't know," she admitted, crossing her arms to hide her shaking hands. "They just showed up." His jaw clenched, a muscle ticking as he reached for his phone. He dialed a number, his voice low and commanding. "Increase security. No one gets near her without my permission. I want updates hourly." Lena frowned, stepping closer. "You think that's enough?" He hung up, meeting her gaze, and for the first time, she saw something raw in his eyes. Fear, not for himself, but for her. "I won't let anything happen to you," he said, his voice quiet but fierce, like a vow carved in stone. She believed him. Not because of the words, but because of the way he said them, the intensity that rippled through him. But that certainty only deepened her unease. This wasn't just about his inheritance anymore. Someone out there saw her as a target, and Adrian's reaction told her it was personal. "Who would do this?" she pressed, her voice softer now. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the notes. "People who want what I have," he said finally, but the vagueness felt deliberate, like he was shielding her from a truth he wasn't ready to share. She didn't push, not yet, but the weight of his secrets hung between them, a thread she knew she'd have to pull eventually. Lena had just started letting her walls down, lulled by Adrian's quiet protectiveness, when the ground shifted again. She'd gone to his office at Carter Enterprises to drop off a schedule for an upcoming charity event, part of their public facade as a married couple. The door was ajar and she stepped inside without knocking, expecting to find him alone. She didn't. Samantha stood there, her blonde hair cascading over her shoulders, her hand resting on Adrian's chest in a gesture too familiar, too intimate. Lena's breath caught, her feet rooting to the spot as Samantha's voice drifted across the room, low and coaxing. "You don't love her," Samantha murmured, tilting her head with that calculated charm Lena remembered from their first encounter. "You never could. Let's stop pretending." Adrian didn't move, his face a mask of stone, unreadable as ever. Lena's stomach twisted, a sharp ache blooming in her chest. She should have walked away, should have spared herself the rest, but she couldn't. I don't love you, Samantha, Adrian said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. I never did. Lena froze, her heart stuttering. Samantha laughed, the sound bitter and jagged. You don't love her either. You married her for your damn inheritance. The words hit Lena like a slap, raw and unfiltered. She knew that, she'd known it from the start, but hearing it spoken so casually, so cruelly, made it feel new, like a wound reopened. Samantha smirked, her hand still lingering on Adrian's chest. And yet, here you are, playing the devoted husband. Maybe you're the one starting to believe the lie. Adrian's silence was louder than any response. Lena's throat tightened, her vision blurring as she turned to leave. She didn't need to hear more, she couldn't. But as she reached the door, his voice stopped her. Lena? She didn't turn back, didn't trust herself to face him. Her steps echoed down the hall, each one heavier than the last. She'd walked into this marriage with her eyes open, promising herself she wouldn't let it touch her heart. So why did this hurt so much? Why did his silence feel like a betrayal deeper than Samantha's words? Lena sat in the back seat of the car, the city lights streaking past in a haze of gold and shadow. Her hands twisted in her lap, the ring on her finger a cold reminder of the contract she'd signed. She'd told herself from the beginning that this was nothing but a deal, a means to an end. She'd sworn she wouldn't fall for the illusion of something more. But now, doubt gnawed at her. Had she been lying to Adrian, pretending she could keep her distance? Or had she been lying to herself, building walls that were crumbling faster than she could reinforce them? And the worst part, the part that kept her staring out the window, her chest tight, was that she wasn't sure Adrian knew the answer either. Was he still the man who'd offered her a cold transaction? Or was he falling into the same trap she was, caught between the lines they'd drawn and the feelings neither of them could name? Adrian Carter had always understood that power came with a price, enemies lurking around every corner waiting for a chance to strike. He'd built his empire with that knowledge, fortifying it against threats, but he'd never anticipated the blow would come from his own blood. His cousin Daniel had always been a shadow in the family, sharp, ambitious, perpetually resentful of Adrian's success. For years he'd lingered on the edges, biding his time. Now he'd found his opening. Lena, the unexpected fulcrum of Adrian's carefully laid plans. Lena didn't know the storm she was walking into when she agreed to meet Daniel for lunch. He'd framed it casually, a friendly catch-up with her new family. And she'd gone, hoping to keep the peace. They sat in a sleek downtown restaurant, the clink of glasses and hum of conversation filling the air. Daniel leaned back in his chair, all charm and easy smiles, swirling his wine glass as he studied her. So, how much did Adrian pay you to marry him? His tone was light, almost playful, but his eyes gleamed with intent. Lena's spine stiffened, her fork pausing midair. Excuse me? He smirked, leaning forward, elbows resting on the table. Come on, let's not pretend. Everyone has a price. What's yours? A cold, sinking feeling coiled in her stomach. She'd walked into a trap. She could feel it in the way he watched her, like a predator sizing up its prey. Keeping her voice steady, she met his gaze. If you're looking for gossip, you're wasting your time. Daniel chuckled, tapping his phone on the table, a deliberate gesture that made her pulse spike. Oh, I'm not looking for gossip. I'm looking for proof. Her blood ran cold. He was recording her, waiting for her to slip, to confirm the contract marriage and hand him the leverage to dismantle Adrian's inheritance claim. The walls of the restaurant seemed to close in, the chatter around her fading into a dull roar. If she said the wrong thing, it could unravel everything. Not just for Adrian, but for her father, her future, the fragile life she'd built. She acted on instinct, grabbing her glass of water and flinging it in his face. Daniel jerked back, sputtering and cursing as the liquid dripped down his shirt. Lena stood, her voice sharp. You think you can trap me that easily? You're pathetic. She turned and strode out, her heart pounding in her chest, the restaurant's murmurs rising behind her. As she stepped onto the bustling sidewalk, the adrenaline ebbed, replaced by a chilling realization. Daniel wouldn't stop. He wanted Adrian's empire, and now she was a weapon in his arsenal. Back at the penthouse, Lena paced the living room, her mind racing. Should she tell Adrian? He was already juggling threats, mysterious notes, unseen watchers. Adding Daniel to the mix might push him over the edge. She'd just decided to keep it quiet when the door opened. Adrian stepped in, loosening his tie, his frame filling the doorway. "You're home early." She hesitated, forcing a casual tone. "Yeah, lunch was cut short." He frowned, stepping closer, his gaze narrowing. "Something happened." "It's nothing," she said, pasting on a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Adrian's expression darkened, his voice low and firm. "Don't lie to me." Lena clenched her fists, the weight of his stare breaking her resolve. "Fine. Your cousin tried to set me up. He wanted me to admit our marriage was a contract." Adrian's face turned lethal, a quiet fury simmering beneath his calm. "What did you say?" "I didn't say anything." She crossed her arms, meeting his intensity. "But this isn't over. He's coming for you." A muscle in his jaw twitched, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Let him try." She'd seen Adrian cold and ruthless before, a man who crushed obstacles without blinking. But this was different. This was personal, a fire she hadn't glimpsed until now. And as she watched him, a new fear took root. Not of Daniel's schemes, but of what Adrian might do to protect what was his. Lena thought she'd weathered the worst. Daniel's trap, the lingering threats, the tension with Adrian. She was wrong. That evening, Adrian was called away for an urgent meeting at Carter Enterprises, leaving her alone in the penthouse. The quiet pressed in, amplifying her restless thoughts. She was about to head to bed when her phone buzzed on the counter, an unknown number flashing on the screen. "Meet me downstairs, it's about Adrian." Her stomach twisted, a mix of dread and curiosity pulling at her. She knew it was a risk, but the message gnawed at her, demanding answers. Slipping on a coat, she rode the elevator down, her pulse quickening with each floor. A black car idles at the curb, its tinted window rolling down as she approached. Samantha's face emerged, her blonde hair catching the streetlight, her smile sharp and calculated. Lena's pulse spiked, her voice cold. "What do you want?" "To warn you," Samantha said, her tone smooth but edged with malice. Lena folded her arms, keeping her distance. "About what?" Samantha leaned closer, her eyes glinting. "You think Adrian's protecting you? You have no idea what he's capable of." Lena's breath hitched, but she forced her expression to stay neutral. "I'm not interested in your lies. Are you sure?" Samantha smirked, holding up her phone and pressing play. Adrian's voice crackled through the speaker, low and unmistakable. "I don't love her. This is just business." The words hit Lena like a punch, stealing the air from her lungs. Her vision blurred, the street tilting beneath her feet. Samantha tilted her head, watching her reaction. "You're just a means to an end. You know that, right?" Lena swallowed hard, her throat burning. "Why are you telling me this?" Samantha's smile widened, predatory and triumphant. "Because I want him back. And once you realize the truth, you'll walk away." Lena's hands clenched at her sides, nails digging into her palms. She'd known their marriage was a contract, had repeated it to herself like a mantra, but hearing it in Adrian's voice, stripped of emotion, shattered something she hadn't realized she'd built. Without a word, she turned and walked away, her steps unsteady, Samantha's laughter echoing behind her. Back in the penthouse, she stood by the window, staring at the city lights until they blurred into streaks. She'd promised herself she wouldn't care, that she'd keep her heart out of this. But the ache in her chest told her she'd failed, and now she wasn't sure she could stay. Adrian returned home late, the penthouse dark and silent. Something felt off the moment he stepped inside, a stillness that set his nerves on edge. He called out for Lena, his voice echoing unanswered. His gut twisted as he spotted a note on the kitchen counter, her handwriting stark against the white paper. "I need space." 2 words, simple and final, but they hit him like a physical blow. His chest tightened, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. Panic, raw and unfamiliar. He grabbed his phone, dialing her number, but it rang out, her voicemail cutting through the silence like a taunt. He sank onto a stool, the note crumpled in his fist. She'd left him. After everything, the threats, the shifting dynamics, the unspoken moments, he'd lost her. And the worst part wasn't the threat to his inheritance or the empire he'd fought for. It was the realization that her absence carved a hole he hadn't known existed. He'd built this marriage as a transaction, a means to secure his future. But somewhere along the way, Lena had become more. More than a contract, more than a necessity. And now, with her gone, he couldn't deny it. He didn't just need her. He wanted her. Adrian stood, resolve hardening in his chest. He didn't know where she'd gone, but he'd find her. Not because of the deal, but because losing her wasn't an option he could accept. Lena sat in a hotel room across the city, the hum of the air conditioner the only sound as she stared at her reflection in the mirror. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the sink. She told herself she wouldn't get attached, that this was just a contract, a lifeline for her father, a stepping stone to freedom. So why did it feel like her heart had been ripped out, leaving a jagged void she couldn't fill? And why, despite Samantha's recording, despite Daniel's schemes, despite every rational reason to walk away, did she still want to go back? The phone on the bed buzzed, Adrian's name lighting up the screen. She didn't answer, but her fingers hovered over it, torn between the pain she felt and the pull she couldn't shake. Lena sat on the edge of the hotel bed, her phone dark and silent in her lap. She'd turned it off hours ago, the weight of the day, of Adrian's silence, Samantha's taunts, Daniel's schemes, pressing down on her until she couldn't breathe. Hiding felt like her only refuge, but deep down, she knew it couldn't last. With a shaky breath, she powered it on, steeling herself for whatever waited. The screen lit up, notifications flooding in like a tidal wave. Texts, voicemails, alerts. Then she saw it. Her face splashed across news headlines, her name in bold, accusatory type. Gold digger wife caught in secret deal. CEO's wife admits she married him for money. Her stomach churned, a wave of nausea rising as she clicked on the video link. The footage was grainy, her lunch with Daniel chopped and stitched together with ruthless precision. Her voice, distorted, rearranged, played out in damning snippets. "It's a contract. $5 million. The edits cut out her defiance, her refusal, twisting her words into a confession she'd never made. Lena's hands trembled, the phone slipping from her grip. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a calculated attack, a setup designed to destroy her. And Adrian would see it. He'd believe it. She grabbed her coat, her mind racing as she bolted from the hotel. She had to get to him, to explain before the lies took root. The city streets blurred past as she flagged a cab, her pulse hammering in her ears. She couldn't lose him. Not like this. Lena burst into Carter Enterprises, her breath ragged as she pushed past the reception desk. The receptionist barely glanced up, pressing a button with a bored flick of her wrist. Moments later, Adrian's office door swung open, and there he stood. Arms crossed, jaw tight, his presence a wall of controlled fury. His gray eyes met hers, but they were cold, devoid of the warmth she'd once glimpsed in quiet moments. No trace of the man who'd pulled her close in the dark, who'd whispered promises of protection. Just ice. "You saw it," she said, her voice breaking as she stepped inside. Adrian lifted his phone from the desk and tossed it toward her, the screen flashing with the headline that had haunted her cab ride. "I saw everything." His tone was measured, but an edge sliced through it. a sharpness that cut deeper than she'd expected. Lena swallowed, her throat burning. "It's not real. You have to believe me. Daniel set me up. He edited it, twisted everything." He leaned forward, hands bracing against the desk, his expression a mask she couldn't read. "So it was all about the money?" The question hit her like a blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She took a shaky step back, her voice trembling. "You really think I'd betray you like that?" Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. He didn't answer, didn't move, just watched her with those piercing eyes as if searching for a truth he wasn't sure he'd find. That silence was worse than any accusation. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back, refusing to let them fall. "If you don't trust me," she said, her voice steadying despite the ache, "there's nothing left to say." She turned and walked out, each step a battle against the urge to look back. The door clicked shut behind her, and with it, something inside her shattered. Pieces she wasn't sure she could ever put back together. Adrian stood rooted behind his desk, his fingers digging into the polished wood as Lena's footsteps faded down the hall. Every nerve screamed at him to follow her, to pull her back, to demand answers. But the headlines, the video, those clipped, damning words, looped in his mind, clouding his judgment. She'd always been a puzzle to him, a woman who'd walked into his life with quiet strength, defying his expectations at every turn. He'd let her in, let her past his walls, convinced himself she was different. Had he been wrong? Had he been a fool to trust her? The office phone rang, slicing through his spiraling thoughts. He snatched it up, his voice a low growl. "What?" Daniel's chuckle crackled through the line, smug and deliberate. "Trouble in paradise, cousin?" "You did this," Adrian said, his tone sharp enough to draw blood. "I have no idea what you're talking about," Daniel replied, his feigned innocence dripping with mockery. Adrian's grip tightened, the plastic creaking under his hand. "You think I won't bury you for this?" Daniel sighed, theatrical and unconcerned. "Relax, Adrian. It's just business." "You just declared war," Adrian snapped, ending the call with a force that rattled the desk. He grabbed his coat, his mind racing. Daniel's betrayal was a threat to his empire, a calculated move to seize control. But as he stormed toward the door, a deeper fear gripped him, one he couldn't shake. Losing the company was a risk he'd always accepted. Losing Lena? That was something he hadn't prepared for. Lena returned to the hotel in a daze, her movements mechanical as she packed her bags. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in as she folded clothes she barely remembered bringing. She had nothing left to hold on to. Not Adrian, not the fragile hope she'd let herself cling to. He'd made his choice, standing there in silence as she walked away. Now she had to make hers. A knock at the door jolted her from her thoughts. She opened it, expecting a bellhop or a maid, but instead Samantha stood there, arms crossed, her smirk as sharp as ever. Lena's heart sank, exhaustion warring with anger. "What do you want?" "I told you this would happen," Samantha said, her voice smooth and cutting. Lena clenched her jaw, stepping back. "Leave." Samantha didn't budge, leaning closer instead. "You're wasting your time. Adrian's not coming after you. He's too proud." The words struck deep, a blade twisting in an already open wound. Lena's breath caught, her hands balling into fists at her sides. She knew Samantha was baiting her, trying to break her resolve, but the doubt lingered, heavy and unshakable. What if she was right? "Get out," Lena said, her voice low and firm, shoving past the sting in her throat. Samantha lingered for a moment, her smirk faltering, then turned and left. The door clicked shut, leaving Lena alone with the echo of her words. The next morning, Lena stood at the airport gate, her boarding pass crumpled in her hand. The hum of travelers and announcements buzzed around her, but she barely heard it. She'd booked the first flight out. Anywhere, it didn't matter. As long as it took her away from this city, this life, this pain. She told herself it was the right choice, the only way to protect what was left of her heart. She wasn't just leaving Adrian, she was leaving the version of herself who'd dared to hope, who'd let herself fall despite every warning. As she handed her pass to the attendant, a memory flashed. Adrian's hand brushing hers in the quiet of the penthouse, his voice soft as he'd said, "I won't let anything happen to you." She pushed it down, stepping onto the jetway, but the ache in her chest lingered, a piece of herself she couldn't reclaim. Adrian sat in his office, the city skyline stretching beyond the glass, an empty bourbon glass in front of him. For the first time in years, the silence felt suffocating. Not the calm control he'd mastered, but a void that pressed against his ribs. His phone buzzed on the desk, a single message lighting up the screen from his security chief. "She's gone." A hollow ache spread through his chest, sharp and unrelenting. He stared at the words, the glass trembling in his hand before he set it down. For the first time, Adrian Carter realized something terrifying. He'd built an empire on certainty, on power, but he'd lost the one thing he hadn't known he needed. And now she is gone. Adrian sat in his office, the empty glass still clutched in his hand. The message, "She's gone," burning into his mind. The realization hit him like a freight train. He might have just lost the only woman he'd ever truly cared about. Not a business deal, not a contract, but Lena. Her strength, her quiet defiance, the way she'd slipped past every defense he'd built. His fists clenched, knuckles whitening. He could destroy Daniel, ruin his career, his reputation, every ambition he'd ever chased. But none of it mattered now. Revenge could wait. There was only one thing on his mind. Lena. If he didn't fix this, didn't find her, he'd lose her forever. And that was a price he couldn't pay. He surged to his feet, storming out of the building, the cool night air hitting him as he dialed her number. Straight to voicemail, her voice calm, steady, only sharpened the panic clawing at his chest. He tried again. Nothing. "Get the jet ready, now!" He barked into his phone, calling his driver as he slid into the back of the car. The engine roared to life, tires screeching as they peeled toward the private airstrip. His mind raced, a tangle of what-ifs. What if he was too late? What if she'd boarded that plane, vanishing from his life? What if she never forgave him for the doubt, the silence that had driven her away? But none of that mattered. He wasn't giving up, not on her, not now, not ever. As the city lights blurred past, he made a vow. He'd find her, and he'd make this right, no matter what it took. Lena stood in the airport lounge, her boarding pass creased in her grip, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She told herself this was the right move, leaving Adrian, leaving the pain, starting over somewhere new. But every second ticked by with an ache she couldn't shake, a pull she couldn't name. "Final boarding call for Flight 172 to Paris," the intercom crackled. She inhaled sharply, her feet shifting toward the gate. Just as she took a step, a commotion erupted behind her. Shouts, footsteps, a voice cutting through the noise. "Lena." Her breath caught, her body freezing mid-motion. She turned, and there he was, Adrian Carter. Breathless, his tie askew, his eyes wild with desperation. He looked nothing like the composed CEO she'd first met. Disheveled, raw, staring at her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. "Don't go," he said, his voice rough, pleading. Lena clenched her jaw, fighting to hold her ground. "You didn't believe me when it mattered." He stepped closer, closing the distance between them, his gaze unwavering. "I was a fool, but I love you." The words hung in the air, heavy and unguarded. Lena gasped, shaking her head as if she could push them away. "You don't love me, "I do," he cut in, his voice breaking. "I fought it, denied it. But the moment you walked out of that office, I knew—" He paused, swallowing hard, his composure cracking. "I knew I couldn't live without you." Tears welled in her eyes, blurring his face. She wanted to argue, to cling to the hurt, but his words pierced through her defenses. Adrian took her hands, his grip firm but trembling. "Give me another chance. Not because of the contract, not because of any deal." His voice dropped, raw and earnest. "But because I need you." A long silence stretched between them, the airport fading into a distant hum. Lena searched his face, his eyes, his furrowed brow, the vulnerability he'd never shown before. She looked for hesitation, for doubt, but found none. Only the truth. Slowly, a smile broke through her tears, fragile but real. Adrian exhaled a shaky breath of relief and pulled her into his arms, holding her like he'd never let go again. The crowd around them blurred, their embrace a quiet anchor in the chaos. That night, Adrian brought Lena back to the penthouse, not as his contract wife, but as the woman he loved. The air between them felt different, lighter, unburdened by expectations or pretense. They moved through the space in a quiet rhythm, shedding the weight of the past weeks. In the living room, he poured 2 glasses of wine, handing her one with a softness in his gaze she hadn't seen before. They talked, really talked, for hours about her fears, his regrets, the moments they'd both misunderstood. When he reached for her hand, pulling her close, there was no rush, no pressure, just them. His lips found hers, a kiss that started gentle but deepened with a quiet intensity. Lena's heart raced, her hands resting against his chest as he pulled back, his forehead pressing to hers. "I've wanted this," he murmured, "longer than I'd admit." He led her to his bedroom, not the guest room she'd once called hers, but his space, a threshold crossed. When he laid her down, his touch was careful, reverent, every movement deliberate. Lena trembled beneath him, her breath hitching. I don't know how." "Shh," he whispered, brushing a kiss against her lips. "I'll take care of you." And he did, slowly, passionately, guiding her with a tenderness that erased every doubt. As their bodies moved together, the world outside faded, leaving only the connection they'd fought to find. This wasn't a marriage on paper anymore, it was something deeper, something unbreakable. When she fell asleep in his arms, her head resting against his chest, Lena felt a peace she'd never known. For the first time, she felt truly loved. Not as a means to an end, but as herself. Weeks later, life had settled into a new rhythm. The threats from Daniel had quieted. Adrian's legal team had moved swiftly, boxing him into a corner with lawsuits and injunctions. Samantha had vanished from their orbit, her schemes unraveling in the face of their united front. Lena and Adrian were rebuilding, step by step, their bond growing stronger with each day. One morning, Lena stood in the bathroom, a small plastic stick in her hands. She'd felt off for days, tired, queasy, a nagging suspicion she couldn't ignore. She stared at the test, then blinked, then stared again. 2 lines. Positive? Her heart pounded, a rush of emotions crashing over her. Shock, joy, fear. She was pregnant with Adrian's child. She covered her mouth, overwhelmed, laughter and tears mingling as she processed it. How would she tell him? Would he be happy? Or would this stir the ghosts of their contract past, a complication neither had planned? The bathroom door creaked open and Adrian stepped in, his brows furrowing as he caught her expression. "Lena? What's wrong?" She swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she held up the test. I'm pregnant." His eyes flickered down, locking on the stick. For a moment, his face was unreadable, a blank slate that made her stomach twist. Then, slowly, a smile broke across his features. Tentative at first, then wide and unguarded. "You're pregnant?" His voice was soft, almost disbelieving. She nodded, nerves fluttering. "I just found out." Adrian took a shaky breath, stepping closer. Without a word, he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against him. His hands cradled her, one resting gently on her back, the other brushing her hair. When he pulled back, his eyes shone with something new. Wonder, gratitude, a joy he couldn't contain. This, he paused, his voice thick. This is everything. Lena laughed, relief flooding through her as he kissed her forehead. Then her lips, his embrace, a promise. In that moment, she knew. They weren't just a couple bound by circumstance anymore. They were a family. A future neither had dared to dream of. Lena and Adrian's story wasn't supposed to happen this way. What started as a cold, calculated arrangement had become something neither of them expected. Something real, something unbreakable. Adrian, the man who once saw marriage as nothing more than a business deal, had found himself willing to risk everything for the woman he never meant to love. And Lena, who had signed the contract thinking she would only endure a temporary arrangement, now held the most permanent piece of him. His child, their future. As Adrian pressed a gentle kiss against Lena's forehead, his hand resting protectively over her stomach, a deep realization settled in. She wasn't just his contract wife anymore. She was his home, his family, his forever. Lena looked up at him, searching his face. Are you sure about this? About us? Adrian let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they weren't from heartbreak. They were from hope. Because love, real love, had found them in the most unexpected way. Sometimes the best things in life don't come from careful planning. Sometimes they come from taking a risk. Would you ever take a risk on love, even if it wasn't part of the plan? Let's hear your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for more stories like this.